I'm Elaine Simon, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Urban Studies program with Mark Stern, who's sitting over there. And we want to welcome you to this first in the public conversation series that we've organized for this spring. And the public conversation series is something that we had done for quite a few years, where we took up some issue or question that Philadelphia was facing, and organized some panels where we would, discuss that issue and try to sort of clarify our thinking on it, and raise the range of issues that come about in relationship to whatever that issue is. And so this year, and then we hadn't done them for a while, so we decided to start up again. And this year, it seemed like a pressing issue was this question of development in Philadelphia. Philadelphia seems to have, sort of begun, or in some people's views, turned a corner, or is turning a corner, or is looking around the corner to be turned. And so we wanted to really ask this question of, as Philadelphia is starting to develop, how can it do that in a way that's equitable? So that was the theme that we wanted. And the way that this is structured is that we integrate this with a class that is offered during the semester, and we've integrated it with Ariel Ben Amis's class on urban sustainability. And he's been very helpful in getting the panel together and so forth. And so we want to thank him for that. And his students have developed some questions for the panel after they've spoken. So they will have a chance to ask the questions they've been thinking about. But the questions are open for all who are here. So, and then we have two more events in the series later on. And on your chairs, you have both the program for tonight, and you also have the whole series on another handout. And you'll see that there's one coming up on March 15th, and that one is in the context of Mark Stern and Ira Goldstein's class on housing, and that one's on vacant land. And then the last is on zoning, intended and unintended consequences, and that's in the context of our course called Intro to City Planning. So look at the dates for those, put them in your calendar, and we hope to see you there, students as well, even though you're not in those classes, if you can make it. And I'm going to turn it over to Ariel.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank our panel in advance for coming as well. My class is URBS 417, Cities in the Local Politics of Sustainability, or as I like to call it, Implementation for Hippies. And this is why I'm particularly excited by the panel that we have in front of us today, because they can speak to a whole host of issues that come to what does it mean to develop equitably and sustainably for our next generation of civic assets in the city of Philadelphia. Nicole Westerman has been, if you've worked in city government as I have for decades, you've heard her name and spearheading projects, and she's now taking on one of the most ambitious projects we now have, in helping steer over close to $500 million worth of investments in our parks and rec systems across the city of Philadelphia. To her right is Jamie Gauthier, who has been a long fixture on Philadelphia's civic scene and is now head of Fairmount Park Conservancy, which does an amazing job inculcating stewardship and investment in our city's parks and rec systems, providing support for our beleaguered PPR itself. Malcolm Burnley, not directly to my left, is a keen observer of Philadelphia's political scene and has seen both the inner workings and the outer workings, and can speak truth to power about what happens when we change our city and what impact it has on our citizens. And finally, directly to my left is Liz Greenspan, who is here to really, is a scholar here at the University of Pennsylvania, and can speak to this effort to rebuild our city park systems as it relates to what's going on across the United States and how it interplays with equity questions therein. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, and we're just going to go down the row as such. I've asked them to speak a little both for the benefit of our students as well, to help explain how they got where they are, because many people here are sitting facing graduation and wondering, where the heck am I going? But also to talk about their work at Rebuild as well. So I'll just turn it over and I'll hold this down here for the time being.
Okay.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. Ariel's words are very kind. I think I'm the most boring candidate you could imagine for the job. Like, I'm the good government dork who likes spreadsheets, and maybe my motto is like, I'm gonna write really good RFPs and and spend your taxpayer money in a really transparent and accountable way. Like really exciting stuff. I also have to watch what I say because
No. Off the record.
So I guess just a word about my background. My undergraduate degree is in architecture. I actually worked for the city of Philadelphia for a while, managing capital projects a million years ago. So this is my second stint with the city. And probably, if you have seen my resume, kind of can't hold a job. Worked for public financial management for a number of years, consulting with lots of different city governments and counties on their budgets and their capital programs. I worked for the school district. I've worked for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for the budget secretary for PIDC. Kind of if you imagined Rebuild and like sort of put together like need capital project management experience, need budget management experience, need experience developing financing programs for small businesses, like, hey, it's me. So really lucked out. It was John Grady who's the president of the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, who knew me from my time at PIDC and thought of me as a project manager in the planning process for Rebuild, and I kind of got to stick around. So that's kind of how I got here, but also don't want to leave out that I have the most incredible team imaginable. So whenever you see good things, like something about Rebuild that you're impressed with, you should think of 4 people. Kira Strong, who's our deputy for design and construction, who came to us from the People's Emergency Center. David Gould, who came from the William Penn Foundation, who's our deputy for community engagement and communications. Jean Emmons, who's our deputy for finance and administration, who has great experience in the Federal Office of Management and Budget, and also working for the Congressional Budget Office and the state of Washington. And then Sheila Ireland, last but not least, who came to us from the University City District, who is a nationally recognized workforce development expert. So really a dream team. So I really wanted to try to specifically address Ariel's sort of some points that he laid out. So to jump right into equity, I just wanted to start like the introduction. So Rebuild, $500 million of improvements to parks, rec centers, and libraries across the city. The whole goal is equitable investment in Philadelphia, and we're trying to go after equity in 3 different ways. So we talk about Rebuild as having 3 pillars. One is physical improvements. So the first piece of equity is, where are we investing? We're trying to invest in the neighborhoods that need it the most. The second pillar of Rebuild is community engagement. So equity there is, we're trying to make sure that the residents who are going to be using these facilities are involved in a really meaningful way in what the improvements look like, so that they feel ownership over these facilities. And then the third piece of equity has to do with that third pillar, which is diversity and inclusion. So if we're going to make $500 million worth of investments in Philadelphia, we want to make sure that it's Philadelphians and it's diverse Philadelphians who are benefiting economically from those improvements. So how can we involve minority and women-owned businesses in an unprecedented way in these in the contracts and the work? And how can we also use this as an opportunity to try to get more minorities and women into the building trades in Philadelphia? And then I also just wanted to mention the vision and commitment of three parties in particular. So one is Rebuild is because of Mike DeBerardinis, who is the managing director of the City of Philadelphia, a long-term city government person, also state government person, also stint at William Penn, and also at his heart a community activist. And Mike managed the parks system for many years, and it was Mike who recognized there's so much need in the system, but there's also so much promise, and that we have a moment in time where he just had this idea, like what if we invested $500 million? And he talked to Mayor Kenny before Mayor Kenny was mayor, and he embraced this vision as his own. So Mayor Kenny's the second person I want to mention. I don't get to spend a whole lot of time with the mayor, but whenever I am with him, I hear every single time his focus on hammering away at Philadelphia's poverty rate of 26%, and the importance of diversity. I hear it from Mayor Kenny every single time I am with him, and Rebuild is part of his commitment to those two efforts. And then the third party is the William Penn Foundation. So Mike kind of hatched this idea, and William Penn adopted it also, and has come in with a $100 million commitment, which is their largest commitment in the foundation's history. The foundation has an amazing history of investing in public spaces in Philadelphia, has an amazing history of investing in meaningful community engagement in Philadelphia, and they were at a moment where they wanted to pivot from investing in Center City, Philadelphia, to investing in the neighborhoods. And so it's really those three making Rebuild happen. And then the mayor and his staff and city council then following through with the beverage tax that will make Rebuild possible. So of $500 million, $300 million would be bonds that can only get paid back if we have a beverage tax that is legal, proved to be legal. $100 million from the William Penn Foundation, $48 million from the city's capital budget, and then the remainder we are trying to raise from other grants from both foundations and state and federal grants. So the goal here is a system of equitable investment. So the William Penn Foundation could easily say, we plan on making one-off investments in lots of different neighborhoods in the coming years. But that is not what Rebuild is about. That's not what we're trying to do. What William Penn was interested in doing was funding a system. And that's why Rebuild started, the foundation was a planning process. Interface Studio Urban Planners led that process with Anthropogon Landscape Architects, Buell Kratzer Powell Architects, and I was sort of the liaison between the consultants and William Penn Foundation and the city in that process. And the whole idea was, if we have a system of over 400 parks, rec centers, and libraries, how are we going to prioritize projects in a systematic way and in a way that is bolstering the overall goal, which is equity, which is investing in the neighborhoods that need it. So the planning process gave us a structure by partly through neighborhood mapping and data analysis, and that gives us a structure where we identify higher need neighborhoods as ones with higher health risks, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of drug offenses, and then we identify neighborhoods that are in transition that have the possibility of investments having a stabilizing effect or a catalytic effect. And so those are neighborhoods identified through TRF's market value analysis or household growth or residential building permits. That planning structure also looked at where are facilities located close to each other, or where are they located close to other neighborhood assets like schools or city health centers or PAL centers, where you could kind of have some economies of scale of public service delivery. We looked at other planning processes, what areas have been prioritized through other efforts, and then very importantly, what are the physical conditions of facilities? Where is their physical need? So you have this this prioritization structure, and through a rebuild plan, we took that structure and then tried to define our approach to community engagement and to business supports and to an apprentice-ready program that would offer opportunities to minorities and women to get into the building trades. And then we get to City Council. And so I'm sure you know that City Council has 17 members. 10 of them are district members, and 7 of them are at-large members. And I think conceptually the goal of that is for the parochial interests of the district members to be balanced by the citywide view of the at-large members. However, I guess I would say, I have to have a however in here. In my limited experience so far, in practice, what I see is the at-large members deferring to district council members on any issue that is place-based. So that larger, that citywide perspective of the at-large members, I don't see taking a very active role. And so in the spring, there was a legislative process that resulted in an ordinance that will allow us to issue bonds for rebuild. In that process, I think the dynamics were largely about district council members working out a series of checks and balances for how rebuild would be operationalized. And as we now look to City Council to approve a first list of projects and first budget for rebuild, it remains to be seen whether whether that will sort of get passed as is, or whether additional checks and balances may be introduced in that process. How am I doing for time? All right. I'll just say kind of one other thing. Rebuild is needed in part because of really huge physical need in these facilities. I know a lot of you guys are students, so I'm not sure how much time you've spent in city rec centers or parks. We have some that are spectacularly beautiful. We have some that are tragically in disrepair. We have many that have swings that have been removed because the safety surface underneath them has been worn through, so they're not safe. Bless you. We have stories of maintenance people who chase basketball players around gym courts with a mop because the roofs are leaking. We have other maintenance people who are boiling water on a stove to mop the floor because there's not working hot water heaters. So that's why that was sort of how Rebuild got started, was to address this enormous backlog of physical need. And a question that I get a lot is, so once we get Rebuild done, hopefully we will have improved 150 or more facilities. Hopefully we do that in a way that is smart enough and well done enough that they are more sustainable in themselves. They're easier to maintain. They hold their value better. But what happens in the long term? In another 20 years, another 25 years, is another rebuild necessary? Or is the city's capital program going to change in any systemic way to reflect the ongoing investments that we should be making to keep city facilities in good repair? I don't, that's a question above my pay grade, and it's a question that obviously goes way into the future. But I think we all know that that Philadelphia it's a very large city with a lot of facilities, a weak tax base, and a lot of pressing needs on the budget, and those needs don't look like they are going to ease off in the near future. So one of our hopes for Rebuild is to establish a maintenance endowment that can at least gnaw away at the fringes of the ongoing maintenance needs, and then the efforts in terms of community engagement, in terms of getting neighborhoods to feel ownership of their facilities, of involving neighborhood nonprofits in the renovation of facilities. All of those efforts are also hoped to improve the sustainability of facilities going forward. So stay tuned.
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Jamie Gauthier. I'm the executive director of the Fairmount Park Conservancy. As Ariel described, we're a support to our city's Parks and Recreation Department. I wanted to expound on that a little bit. I see our, and so first, we support the city to advance not just Fairmount Park proper, but all neighborhood public parks across our city. And I see our work breaking down in a few ways. So one, we do capital improvements in the park and on the park's historic structures. So as an example, we're building a pretty large project right now out in Parkside called Centennial Commons. We're just about done with phase one and are moving towards phase two. But when we are complete, it'll be a $12 million brand new sort of state-of-the-art park with an ice skating ribbon, and so very cool stuff. But that's just one example of what we do in the area of capital improvements. We also do quite a lot to activate park spaces and to make them more fun and engaging for residents. So an example is the Oval. It's a 5-week pop-up park that we do every summer in front of the Art Museum. And so we transform it from, a parking space essentially to a place where folks can come and hear music and do yoga and visit the beer garden. And that's just one example of how we activate, public spaces all over the city throughout the park system. And then also we focus quite a lot on community engagement. So with Parks and Rec, we support 115 volunteer park friends groups who are key partners to the city of Philadelphia in the stewardship of their neighborhood parks and in engaging their fellow residents at their neighborhood parks. And so those are the main areas of our work. I'm fairly new as the ED of the Conservancy. I joined the organization in January of 2017 as a part of the senior management team, not as ED. So I joined as Senior Director of Public Partnerships under a new ED, and as it turns out, that situation wasn't the best fit. And so I was appointed as Executive Director in July of 2017. But was thrilled, absolutely thrilled to take on the opportunity. When I was excited to come to the Conservancy and, joining as a part of the staff, I was able to see the great staff team that was there, the wonderful board that's there, and all of the great work we were doing for parks. So was absolutely thrilled to take on the role of ED. Additionally, I've spent my whole career in community and economic development. So prior to coming to the Conservancy, I led a smaller nonprofit called the Sustainable Business Network. And prior to that, I worked for Local Initiative Support Corporation, which is a national community development intermediary. And I'm actually a graduate of Penn's Master's in City Planning program. Came out of Penn in 2004. And so all of us at the Conservancy are incredibly excited for Rebuild because it's sort of like an expansion of all of the things that we care about and have been focusing on since our inception. And we're also excited to be one of 21 nonprofits designated to carry out the actual capital improvements connected to Rebuild and the community engagement that will happen in connection with those capital improvements. So, we're all thrilled to be a part of Rebuild's future. Ariel asked me specifically to come and talk to you about my sense of how nonprofits and the philanthropic community had helped to lay the groundwork for Rebuild. And so that's what I wanted to focus on. So we're incredibly excited about the future, but also with a lot of other partners, we've contributed somewhat to the past and the things that led up to Rebuild in a few key ways. So one, I wanted to talk to you about our park stewardship program because I think that has, although there have been a lot of factors and a lot of leaders who have brought Rebuild to the fore, I think park stewardship has been a contributor in certain ways, especially as it relates to community engagement. So again, our park stewardship effort is the one where we're working with thousands of volunteers across the city who are part of park friends groups who really kind of take care of parks with Parks and Rec, keep an eye on their neighborhood parks, and help the city to really sustain neighborhood parks on a very limited budget. And so with Parks and Rec, we help to build the capacity of those groups. We help them to start and sustain themselves, and we help to connect them to one another. So through the Park Friends Network, there's sort of like this incredible learning network for volunteer park friends groups where they can come together and share and learn from one another and continue to develop their skills. And so the way that I think that's contributed to Rebuild is, one, these are the folks who advocated for a Rebuild, right? So while you had sort of the soda guys kind of circling City Hall with their big trucks and making a lot of noise, the park friends groups and, led by partners like the Philadelphia Parks Alliance, that George Matisic, who runs that organization, is sitting in the back, they were advocating for parks, right, and for kids. And I think that's a big part of why we won that battle, why we have the soda tax and why we have Rebuild. And so they're a huge source of advocacy for Rebuild and other initiatives to sustain parks. And also these folks, these thousands of folks who are vested in their parks and their recreation centers and their libraries are the folks who will continue stewarding these public spaces when Rebuild as an initiative wraps up, right? They'll be there still in the community stewarding these assets. And so I think that's really key to where we are today and to where we're going with the initiative. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is civic commons. So the Fairmount Park Conservancy is the facilitator, the local facilitator of a national initiative called Civic Commons. The initiative is all about developing public spaces in a way that will stimulate civic engagement, environmental sustainability, and the connection of people who are from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. It's sort of a partnership as well. So we facilitate along with several other partners. And together we've brought online 5 public spaces. So one is Centennial Commons in Parkside. The second is the Discovery Center, which is sort of like a nature learning center in Strawberry Mansion. The third is the Lovett Library in Park. The fourth is Bartram's Mile in Southwest Philadelphia. And the fifth is the Rail Park, which will be under construction and spans several neighborhoods, including Chinatown. And so, the initiative was funded here locally by the William Penn Foundation and the Knight Foundation. And as Nicole mentioned earlier, it was a part of the effort of those foundations to move to transition their public space investments from just downtown to neighborhoods. And so they together, Knight and William Penn invested, I believe, 13 million altogether in bringing these 5 public spaces online and in stimulating civic engagement around these spaces. And not only was it a continuation of their strategy to invest in neighborhoods in an equitable way, it was also the first time, I believe, that they invested in 5 public spaces at one time. And so together, this investment brought a level of, in addition to bringing some really great public spaces that are either all complete or under construction, it stimulated civic engagement. It helped to build leadership. It stimulated a new level of collaboration amongst public space actors who had never worked together. And it happened like en masse, so everything had an even greater effect than it would have if it happened by itself. And so I think that both of those things, even though there were many other factors, can be counted as things that contributed to the groundwork for rebuild. Additionally, another reason why I say that or have that opinion is because those foundations both sort of doubled down in their investment. So recently, as it relates to the stewardship, recently the Knight Foundation granted the Conservancy a $3.28 million grant over a 3-year period in expanding stewardship and support to stewardship groups. So with partners including the Philadelphia Parks Alliance, the Free Library of Philadelphia, and Parks and Rec, we're able to help even more park friends groups and library friends groups and recreation advisory councils who are the ones who steward their neighborhood rec centers. And that investment was made because the Knight Foundation realized that you need to have that strong civic infrastructure to sustain a massive capital investment like rebuild, right? Because even when the parks are built and the libraries are built, these are the folks that will be there. And the foundation wanted to invest in their ability to take on that stewardship role. Additionally, the foundation made its biggest gift ever of $100 million towards rebuild. And though I think there were a lot of factors, they have cited Civic Commons as being, and the success of Civic Commons as being part of their consideration for making an even larger investment in an even larger set of public spaces. So that's what I wanted to say to you all, and I look forward to the discussion.
And this work? Yeah, okay, there we go. Malcolm Burnley. I definitely have the shortest resume out of anyone up here, so I'll keep that short. Well, there's not much to it. So I was a graduate of Brown University in 2012, and I actually don't really have any formal training in civic planning, city planning, architecture. My bachelor's degree was in English. And while I was at Brown, really focused on a lot of nonfiction writing. So I was always interested in cities. I grew up in Staten Island in New York, which is a very strange city experience. It's just a kind of a bizarre place. And I've lived in, although I went to high school in the suburbs, I've lived in cities most of my life. So I've always been really interested in that, and from an equity and social justice aspect, or I should say standpoint. So from Brown, I spent a year, I had a fellowship at the Atlantic magazine in Washington, D.C. I was mostly doing research and a little bit of writing for them. And I moved to Philadelphia the year after in 2013, and I've been here ever since, so about 5 years. Over the time I've been here, I've written about all sorts of crazy characters and subjects, but one of the things that's been consistent is been writing about public space. I did a fellowship at Next City that was called the Equitable Cities Fellowship, which looked at issues of equity and social development and physical space across the U.S. and wrote a lot of stories for them. Now doing a lot of work for Plan Philly and WHRY around rebuild. Should probably move in. And so through my experience just doing that and learning about and talking to folks in communities and neighborhoods across the city, I feel like I'm constantly learning about this stuff, but I don't have any specific training in it. So the two things I was supposed to, I think that's probably good for bio. The two things that I wanted to give some grounding on before we open it up. The first being kind of what the antecedents to rebuild are, or what's kind of come before in terms of big capital improvement projects in Philadelphia that have similarities and differences that have kind of laid the groundwork for this. And the second thing is just some of the politics that have impacted and changed rebuild over the last few years and will probably inform it going forward. Some of it Nicole already touched on and probably is way more familiar than I am in that. But so the first thing, I guess you'll hear this come up in a lot of, in the context of rebuild. The program called Neighborhood Transformation Initiative, which NTI for short, which was Mayor John Street's biggest capital improvement initiative. And it's been brought up, I think sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly in the context of rebuild, because there's a lot of similarities and there's also a lot of differences between the two. So that project, Mayor Street was the early 2000s, and he introduced this idea, at least in vague terms, when he was campaigning. And NTI was focused on anti-blight in Philadelphia and also focused on primarily on demolishing abandoned structures and then hopefully replacing some of them with mixed rate and affordable housing. The similarities with rebuild is kind of eerie, some of the similarities, even though I think what they're trying to do is very different. So both rebuild and NTI use roughly $300 million in bonds to fund the project. You had a first-term mayor with John Street and then with Jim Kenney. In both cases, both projects talked about private investment and trying to leverage private investment as well as using public dollars. So attracting, outside money to try to reinforce some of these ideas of equity and development. Even the city council vote was 16-1, both for NTI and for rebuild. So there's just a lot of weird parallels there. And also there was kind of this thread running throughout both of the projects that using data to inform where the money was going to be spent. Nicole already outlined some of the work that went into rebuild. With NTI back in the early 2000s, did all these studies about market rate housing and the number of vacancies and tried to create a map across the city about where they might invest in. So NTI was actually it was supposed to unfold over the course of 6 or 7 years. Some of the money actually wound up trickling over all the way till 2015, and I don't think all of it was ever spent. But one of the big talking points on NTI that people have been bringing up in the context of rebuild is that I think the consensus is pretty much NTI didn't have quite the effect that they intended it to have or that Mayor Street wanted it to have. And some of that was because of the politics that went into it. And so I'll get into rebuild in just a sec, but Mayor Street, most of the money for NTI, at least 2/3 of it from the bond proceeds, was supposed to go towards demolishing abandoned buildings or unused buildings or derelict buildings. And they wanted to demolish up to 15,000, and they only wound up being able to demolish roughly 5,000 across the city. Part of that was because of expectations of how much it would cost, but also there was a lot of community pushback. NTI really brought to mind a lot of the urban renewal, urban development initiatives from the 60s and 70s, particularly, I guess all the way into the 80s too, about raising properties, demolishing properties, seizing them through eminent domain. So there was a lot of pushback once the demolitions were actually happening, right? I mean, in principle, I think a lot of people agreed that both Philadelphia needed investment and needed change in a lot of neighborhoods, but once it was happening in the neighborhoods, there was a lot of question about whether that was going to spur gentrification, whether or the demolitions were really just going to invite private businesses in, market rate housing as opposed to affordable housing. So there was a lot of pushback, and one of the things that changed about NTI over the course of it was that a lot of the, I guess, data-driven or kind of market rate analysis that they were trying to distribute the funds with wound up getting bogged down in city council, and a lot of the decisions about where the money was spent and how it was spent was deferred to the city council, the district members, as Nicole gave a good introduction to. And so while NTI did have this lasting effect in the city, I think it's a little bit ambiguous, and people still debate how much positive and how much negative effect it had. Real quick, the one thing people do point to is that Brewery Town was one of the places where it seemed like NTI unfolded pretty much along the lines of what Mayor Street wanted it to happen. So they demolished a lot of properties. They did get private investment. They did get both market rate as well as affordable housing built there. And now Brewery Town is considered a lot more gentrified, and it's kind of in this in-between space where it's getting gentrified much more. And it's not really clear how much NTI, I guess, spurred that, or how much NTI or did not have to do with that changes. So I should also say I wasn't in the city when NTI happened, so I'm probably not the best person to be giving the history on it, but I've researched it a lot in the context of Rebuild. So regarding Rebuild and some of the politics that have shaped it, as Nicole was talking about, it's a project that's been in the works for essentially 3 years, probably as an idea even before that. But a lot of the inner workings in City Hall that have changed it have really happened over the past year. And so the legislation Nicole was referring to went through its usual process through City Hall, through City Council last year. And she was mentioning kind of the 3 pillars of equity that go into Rebuild, or Rebuild was thinking about. And I kind of saw, as the legislation was formed and debated, kind of 3 different areas of tension, or 3 different areas that politics really played a role in shaping it. So one was about, I guess, the geography or the disbursement of where the money was going to go in the city. And so there was a question of, if every city council district was going to get the same amount of projects, was going to get the same amount of money, how are we going to agree to disperse it? And I think Nicole kind of explained how they went through and thinking about that. The second big point of, I guess, tension that emerged was originally the Rebuild team and Mayor Jim Kenney's team had envisioned the project as being delivered by a couple larger nonprofits in the city, and there was a lot of pushback from city council members that they felt like maybe the public accountability or city council members themselves weren't going to have enough say in number one, which facilities were going to get selected, as well as who was going to be getting some of this money. So there was a compromise that was made. I'm probably glossing over a lot of this, and Nicole can definitely correct some of this. But there was a compromise that was made in City Council that City Council members were going to have to sign off on which sites got Rebuild money, but there was also obviously the administration and the Rebuild team, and a lot of the data that data and research they had is also going to go into it. So, and then thirdly, there was just a lot of conversations about how the issue of equity and jobs, in particular, getting minority and women-owned businesses more of the contracts for these Rebuild projects, also getting a pipeline for younger members into the trades. There was a lot of negotiating that happened around that. And NTI, I would ask council members when I was covering some of this, like how much NTI loomed large in their minds, and everyone pretty much said it didn't. But it was kind of obvious that the issues and what happened with NTI in terms of, a lot of people say it got watered down, or that the intentions, the ambition of it, wound up getting sucked up into politics, and then the money wasn't spent the way it was intended. So I think that was significant, and I think Rebuild came up with a lot of more compromises related to that. And let's see. Oh, and I think like the other main thing that's just come up is both NTI and Rebuild are public-private. I'm not going to say partnerships, but I mean they rely on both public and private. And I think a lot of the politics have been around how much the city or how much City Hall wants to, I guess, cede power to private entities. And so, as Nicole was talking about, and as well as Jamie, Rebuild is leaning on the nonprofit sector to deliver a lot of these projects. And so, I think this is the case probably in most cities, but particularly in Philadelphia, there is an old school mentality sometimes that runs through City Hall that, public sector should be controlling where the money is spent and how it's spent. And so one of the big innovations of Rebuild, or one of the big ideas behind it, is that instead of going strictly through the city's procurement program and capital improvements office, it's going to be using a unique structure that relies on both private and nonprofit entities to be delivering it, as well as private money. And so, yeah, that's raised a whole host of issues. So many city council members have been concerned about, whether or not this is going to lead to privatized facilities, which I know Nicole has been really adamant that that's not the case. But because of the way Rebuild is getting delivered, essentially they're having to lease out these libraries, rec centers, lease these facilities out to nonprofits. And that's just the language that's around it in order to, I might be messing this up now. So, but in order to, I guess, get some of the outside funding that's part of it, in order to also lean on the nonprofit sector. So that language of leasing, has been is obviously really loaded, and some people think that, there's going to be a case of privatization, which I don't think will be the case, but those were kind of some of the political wrangling that went on around the project. And it's not to say that it's not going to be the case going forward, but the legislation was passed by City Council, and so at least there's a good framework to work off of at this point.
Thanks. Hi, thanks for having me. I went to college outside of Philadelphia at Haverford, and then I came to Penn to do my graduate work in the anthropology department in cultural anthropology and urban studies. And I am a proud graduate of the urban studies graduate certificate. And I began my interest and studies in public space during that graduate work. I studied the rebuilding process of the World Trade Center site in New York. And I approached it as a public space, as a kind of de facto public space created after 9/11, and studied the political process that unfolded to figure out what to rebuild and who should be in charge of that. And after I wrote that dissertation, I left Philly and moved to Boston for a number of years, where I was a lecturer and I taught writing and urban studies at Harvard, and kept up with the scholarship, but also started to turn towards a more popular writing and writing for popular audiences in magazines and newspapers. And so I wrote a popular book, and have since then kind of kept one foot in the academy and one foot writing for popular press as a freelancer. I came back to Philly a year and a half ago and hooked up with Penn Praxis at the design school here, and Randy Mason, who's on the faculty in the Historic Preservation and City Planning Department. And he and I have been conducting research for the past 2 years on other cities, not Philadelphia. We really haven't been studying Philly. So I'm here, I think, to offer some lessons and insights from the research we've been doing over the past 2 years on other cities and how they're reinvesting in civic assets that have also been neglected for some time. And I do have a few slides, and I just have to figure out how to make them appear. Let's see. I think they need to be plugged in. Okay, sorry. Do you mind? I just have a couple, and it's helpful, I think. They're not actually very visually oriented, and I should say that I was putting this together last night, and my husband came in, and he's a scientist who makes like 5 PowerPoints a day, and he was dismayed at my terrible PowerPoint skills. And so so then I went and I tried to spice it up. And so I apologize for what you're about to see. But as we're right now, I should say, we wrote a paper last spring on the first phase of our research, and we're in the midst of writing our second paper that's coming out this May. We have looked at these cities, but this is not an exclusive list by any means, but New York, Minneapolis, Houston, LA, DC, and Seattle have stood out in our research for taking on projects that are like Rebuild in certain ways and are also ambitious, and illustrating some of what we think are some best practice models, as well as raising some questions and, provoking, illustrating some of the challenges that groups are facing on the ground. It's also important to note that all of these projects are underway. And so the lessons are really unfolding. We don't know exactly how this is working. We do know is that this is, Philly is one of many cities doing this. It's it's a really important question that cities have decided right now is the time, to start investing. But Philly, let's see if is this gonna work? Let's see, I just come around. But Philly's is particularly ambitious. And what I thought I would do, instead of telling you in depth, a lot about each project, I was going to try and tease out some of the main themes and lessons that we've seen across them. And then if there are questions, about individual cities and the things that they're doing, I can answer some questions there. Should I come?
Let me know when.
Okay. Okay. So in general, what's happening across the board is that cities have decided, they've invested in their downtown city centers, in their Rittenhouse Square parks and the like, and they have decided it's now time to turn to the neglected neighborhoods where things are, as Nicole was saying, have been neglected for quite some time, right? We're talking about neighborhoods where there have been decades of maintenance that hasn't been kept up and where it's been underfunded. All of these projects and all of these cities are emphasizing equity as a fueling force of their interest, and are working to define what that means and how to achieve that. There's a real question. And lastly, there is a desire and increasing conversation about an effort to control the impacts of these reinvestments for the existing residents, partly by looking at what has happened in downtown city centers and seeing how a lot of these reinvestments in public spaces can catalyze growth and development and increase property values and trigger gentrification, among a host of other issues, and to say, okay, are there things we can do? So this is on everyone's radar. How exactly you do that, though, is not yet determined. And so when we look at what we did is we looked across these cities, we found that there were two or three primary approaches and 2 to 3 scales that cities were enacting their reinvestments. And the first was a systemic citywide effort like Rebuild. We have New York City, which is doing their Community Parks Initiative, and they are spending about $320 million to invest in 67 sites over the next 5 to 6 years. And then we also have Minneapolis, their neighborhood parks plan, and they are investing $220 million in, what do I have here? In 160 sites over the next 20 years. They've decided to allot $11 million annually for 20 years into these neighborhood parks. Both of these programs, like Rebuild, have done intensive data collection to determine, which sites are the most in need. And Minneapolis is also targeting rec centers and parks, whereas New York, it's just in parks. And I should also note that just in New York, it's existing capital funds. So they have just taken money that they have, whereas in Minneapolis, they voted, New York. In Minneapolis, they voted to increase their property taxes by 1%. And so they're using that money to fund the program. In addition to the systemic citywide efforts, other cities are using what we're calling a charismatic site-based approach, but with the understanding that these charismatic sites will trigger systemic changes, both in the immediate area, but also perhaps and probably across the city as a whole. And so, and I say, think Highline, because that really is a reference that we haven't been able to get away from as we've talked to others and interviewed other people and investigated how cities are doing this. It's both, an incredible success story, but it's also become somewhat of a cautionary tale in certain cities because of the, at that time, the lack of foresight that they had to anticipate the kind of changes that were coming. And so while it's, a fantastic park that drove a lot of growth, only certain people have been able to take advantage of that, and it isn't inclusive in the way that a lot of people, it isn't equitable, right, in the way that we aspire to create these public spaces. So with that in mind, cities are, alongside the investments, are trying to think about how to harness the funds that will be coming in, the development that will be coming in, and to channel it towards the existing residents. And one of the projects that's kind of at the fore of this is in Washington, D.C. with the 11th Street Bridge in Anacostia. And it is one site, it's a bridge that connects the east side of the river in Anacostia with a wealthier west side of the neighborhood. They haven't started yet, it's not built, but they've been underway doing community engagement and have included ambitious equitable development programs as part of their effort to get ahead of these changes. In addition to DC, we have been speaking with people in LA, with the LA River Project, and there it is, and also in Houston with the Buffalo Bayou. And these are sites in that they're natural resources. They're very large, and so they're kind of straddling what we're thinking of as a site or a system, right? Because you have neighborhoods that are spanning miles and miles, but they're all organized around this resource. And in both of these instances, in LA and Houston, there's been talk about, revitalizing these areas for many years. I think in LA, it started as a grassroots effort in '85. Only over the past 5 to 6 years has it started to take root more bureaucratically, and some nonprofits have formed and things like that. So that's something we could talk about, kind of the origins of some of these projects. They have some differences and similarities. When we've looked at these projects across the board, what we found is that community engagement is at the top of cities' lists in terms of something that they're dedicated to. Meeting with residents in advance, often with a goal to channel public input towards the design or the redesign of the spaces, as well as future programming and ongoing maintenance. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of them, almost every one, it's been really striking, has some kind of equitable development program that they're including. This includes workforce development, as Nicole was talking about. Others have affordable housing programs. So in DC, they're creating a land bank, they're banking land and creating a land trust to try and control property values, in the immediate area and create affordable housing. They're also giving support to small businesses. What's not yet known, though, is how well these programs will work and if they're aggressive enough to really capture, that energy towards the existing residents. While we've found that these are shared strategies, one of the takeaways of our research so far is that governance is really one of the most critical issues, particularly when thinking about equity and thinking about the success and failure and where the challenges may lie for these cities and kind of reaching the equitable outcomes that so many people want. And so when we talk about governance, I should say that in all of these, we've been spending the past year interviewing people on the ground in all of these cities in different capacities, officials and nonprofit leaders and people on the ground. And they've been echoing this to us as well, that, like a lot of what it comes back to for how well these programs are working or where they're hitting snags are governance. And there are a few components that are important to mention. Governance includes the institutions that are involved and overseeing the projects, right? And this includes public sector institutions, but also the private institutions, the friends groups, the conservancies that may be involved, as well as the foundations and the philanthropies. And so, it's complex, and it's gotten increasingly complex as the years have gone on, and the public sector has, continued to kind of wither in terms of the funding that it has. But it's also the processes that these institutions are enacting to continue, beyond the initial outlay of funds. Like, how are they building in, and planning for sustainability for the kind of maintenance, the ongoing maintenance work, change in leadership, what kinds of policies internally are they creating, and to keep the community engagement going over time, again, past this initial moment. And 3, we have tried to, there's a lot to talk about besides money, but money is important in all of this. And often we have found that the question of funding is often where, you know, the complexities begin. A lot of the goals in this is putting it, I guess, sort of, it's like putting it lightly. But, you know, local governance is an aspiration. A lot of communities and a lot of cities are really aspiring to create spaces that are locally governed. And initially, we have seen that, you know, there could be really great community engagement efforts. People are really turning out at public meetings. They feel heard. There's a great exchange. And as we get a few further steps down the road, when it becomes time to distribute funds and figure out exactly who's going to get and oversee the way that money is used, the local community groups on the ground, you know, that have been coming out that have helped organize the community engagement, perhaps. Like, there's been a lot of great partnering that goes on. They're not always feeling included in that next decision-making step. And so I think, you know, as I was saying, all of this is unfolding as we speak. And so we'll get to see now how all of these three sectors, public, private, and nonprofit, work together to try to figure out who will remain in charge, and if there is a kind of best practice governance model that we can start to look at and follow for, you know, towards the questions of equity. And, you know, I mean, I'm thinking just of one project, which isn't actually on this list, in San Francisco. It's a small park. It's called Buchanan Mall. And it's both like, you know, it kind of illustrates some of the great things that are happening, but also some of the challenges. There was a local community group in a poor neighborhood, and they mobilized. They wanted to, you know, fix this pretty barren strip in the, you know, that wasn't used and was pretty unsafe. They hooked up with some filmmakers who decided to work with them to kind of get the community talking and figure out what they could do as a group. They were really inspired by the fact that the filmmakers were there. They found, like, talking to them and knowing that their stories were being heard and reflected out into the world and posted online, you know, was really meaningful. They managed to get money. They reached City Hall. They did all of this work. And now, just now, there seems to be some uncertainty about how the resources that they've secured will be managed. And it's going into it will go into that space, but it's not clear yet who exactly will be in charge, whether it will be, you know, the residents on the ground, the filmmakers, an aspect of the city, right? And all of these people were instrumental in making this happen. For the residents, they have said that, you know, it feels like a kind of repeat of something that has happened time and again, right? So, but there's a lot of discussion about this, and there's a lot that's happening. So we've been following this, and, you know, it's happening as I talk. So I will hand it over, and we can have questions.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask two questions. One to make sure we still have Jamie's time while we're to ask that, and then another one for the others. So the first question is very much to Nicole and Jamie, but I'm interested in Malcolm and Liz's perspective on a different level. A lot of my students were, when they emailed me and asked questions, they were asking about engagement. And Nicole, you talked about meaningful engagement in design process, and I'm wondering, what does engagement mean when you're going out? You haven't started any of these projects yet. You haven't gotten authorization. When the money finally starts flowing, what is engagement going to mean? And the question that kind of trickles down to is, Jamie, what kind of engagement has worked in projects that you've seen in the past, and what are you hoping as a project user to be able to implement? And then what do other people think engagement actually means, who are not sitting behind the desks actually in control of the money in the project?
Well, so this might be a little humbling because I am not an expert in this area. She is an expert in this area. George is an expert in this area. But I will say that, so a couple intentions that we have about community engagement for Rebuild. So one is it goes to kind of the what Julie was talking about with inclusion. You know, these improvements are not for future residents. These improvements are for the residents of today. So we hear all the time about volunteers who have been working in rec centers for decades, and trying to keep programs going with bubble gum and duct tape. And what the last thing that they need is for a bunch of people who moved in 6 months ago to come and say what the rec center improvements should look like. So, when the community engagement approach has to be data-based and data-driven. So we need to understand who is there in the neighborhood and make sure that we are reaching a representative sample of neighbors. And we need to understand that the engagement approach has to be very multifaceted in order to reach lots of different people. So for example, we know that there are going to be little old ladies who don't want to leave their home. So how are they going to engage? We want them to be involved in this process. There are going to be parents who are holding 3 jobs and can't make it to a meeting. How are they going to engage? We know that people have different schedules. We know we want to engage young people. We know that we want to engage immigrants. How do we make sure that we host people who speak, whose first language may not be English? And how do you engage with people who may not be comfortable standing up in a public setting, who may not feel comfortable voicing their opinion in a big room? So we know that we need to know who's in the neighborhood. We need to have the data to understand who is getting engaged, whether it's in meetings, whether it's online, whether it's through an app, whether it's coming to an event. We need to track that and make sure that they're being engaged effectively. The end goal is for the improvements to reflect what the neighborhood residents have said. So then we have to have an accountability mechanism ourselves for saying, okay, here's what we heard from community members. And then when the design gets done, we have to be able to look at that design and see how it measures up to what the residents said. Neighborhood residents need to be able to hold us accountable for delivering. And I totally forgot what else I wanted to say. So I'll turn it over to Jamie at this point.
We've really been thinking about engagement in 2 ways. So one, connected to our engagement, we're investing in the capacity of groups that engage, right? Or we're helping the community to create groups to engage. That's a very critical piece to us. There has to be sort of the civic infrastructure there. So the groups that we work most closely with are the Park Friends groups. So a lot of what we're doing as it relates to engagement, it might not be project specific. It's helping those groups to be more sustainable and to access resources so that when there is a program or a project specific issue, they're the folks who can give us input and also get their neighbors to the table. So I think that's a critical piece of it. There are some neighborhoods that have really strong civic organizations that are able to fundraise and carry out advocacy, and there are some neighborhoods where there's a huge gap in that, and so there aren't folks there to sort of organize folks. So a part of what we've done as we've gone about making improvements in the park with the community is to invest in the organizations who are there. Another part is around like project specific engagement, and we've carried that out in a few ways that I think have been successful. So one thing, like Nicole mentioned, is being inclusive and reaching as many people as we can who live in the neighborhood. So sure, we've done sort of the standard kind of in a church basement type engagement, but we've also done things like hire folks from the community to go door to door to get input. We've done things like create activities for kids so they can draw pictures to tell us what they'd like to see in their public spaces. We've carried out engagement online just to ensure that we're reaching everyone who needs to be reached. We've also worked to help people to to think about their public spaces in ways that they might not think about them traditionally. So we've tried to bring ideas from other places. One of the benefits for us of being in Civic Commons is that we get to see public spaces that are kind of happening all over the country. So we've taken a lot of our community partners to trips, which have allowed them to think differently about their public spaces. So we're not just, so when we're talking to them about a park, it's not just, we're just going to put this swing over here. It's, we saw this cool nature playground, or, we saw this other, public space intervention somewhere else. And so bringing new ideas, I think, is a part of engagement as well. And sort of opening up, helping to open people's thinking about what public spaces can be for the community. Another example of that is the work we've been doing with historic houses in the park. So for example, we have an artist in residency at the Hatfield House in Strawberry Mansion. Yeah, Amber Arts. We're working with Amber Arts out there to engage the community about what should happen at the house and more broadly in their public spaces in Strawberry Mansion. And it's incredible to hear, from some of the residents, like, I walked past this house for 20 years and I didn't know I could come in here. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know that it was for me. And so we've just been opening up the house to do what the community wants to do. So last week we had painting with a twist in the Hatfield House, and there were like 50 neighbors there, and they were all painting and listening to music and having a great time, and just using that space in a way that was not used before. We've also had jazz concerts there too. So a piece of our engagement has been about bringing new ideas and helping people to reimagine what their public spaces can be. And that's a part of, as a project user for Rebuild, that's a part of how we like to carry out engagement with. We're still waiting to see kind of how projects will roll out. But once we get a project, we want to do some pretty cool and innovative things that are more than just having a meeting in a church basement, that offer an expanded level of engagement and idea generation.
I'll be quick.
Sorry.
Just a couple of things that jumped to mind along those lines were, one thing that I've heard from Nicole as well as the rest of the Rebuild team, which is interesting, is Rebuild's a citywide project in some ways, but they're also, trying to approach, once these projects are rolled out, obviously thinking citywide in terms of equity, thinking citywide in terms of, the delivery of it, but also being site-specific in terms of engagement is something that I've heard a lot. And I know that the Rebuild team as well has been looking at other, developments that have happened in playgrounds and parks across the city on a more neighborhood basis. Like Sturgis Playground recently I know it's gotten a lot of publicity, but recently got basically a brand new playground. And part of that, the community engagement in the design particularly was a huge emphasis in that. And, even just down to little things about, putting this next to this in the park to try to, create more cross-pollination or something that maybe seniors or an older demographic would frequent, putting it next to something with younger folks. And just like thinking about design in that way. So I think there's been a few projects, besides say Civic Commons and other things across the city that I would think Rebuild is probably going to borrow from. And the second thing I was going to say, which I'm now forgetting. So, the other thing, just real quick, I think I don't envy the challenge that the Rebuild team has, but just in terms of engagement, one of the other threads that seems to be running through this is not just engaging with the folks who currently use the facility, but also the folks who are in the neighborhood or in the vicinity who don't use the facility. And so I think that's always a struggle with an engagement process, is like, how do you reach the folks who might not show up at these? Because part of the aim of Rebuild as well is to create this excitement, as Jamie spoke to try to create this stewardship or new users as well as new stewards of these facilities. So I think that's also something that I just thought I would mention.
Yeah, well, just a couple things came to mind thinking about research and talking to people in other cities. Like connecting with local on-the-ground groups is something that seems to be really important, because as everyone's saying, how do you get people to come out and when you don't know them and you don't live in the neighborhood? And finding, there are official community leaders, but finding those unofficial community leaders who know everyone and bringing them into your fold and talking to them and kind of knowing that they'll spread the word is one strategy. But I think one of the other things that's come up, and I think I'm thinking about Detroit in particular, where they've done some pretty ambitious work on engagement, is acknowledging the history that is kind of underlying a lot of this work, both the reason for the investments now and the neglect that's been there, and therefore the kind of lack of engagement that has persisted, in the lead up to this time. And they have been, there are some really great studies out there that show how they did a citywide audit, basically, to think about what Detroit should become. So it was much bigger than the kind of project that we're talking about here. And there was an incredible lack of trust. And they faced that head on, and they were willing to talk to people about that, almost like first, before getting into the questions of the spaces and the city and what it should be. It was, what has come before and why people may not trust the city at this point to follow through on some of the things that they say they're going to do. And they measured that process, or at least to some degree, with kind of getting feedback from residents, and there was actually a positive response that people felt like they were heard. But it required it wasn't like a runaway success. They had to switch gears at some points. Unexpected things came up. They had to create like a side community engagement to talk about things that they hadn't prepared to hear, right? So it's kind of like that willingness to be flexible and meet residents where they are and hear what they want, which may or may not be a new rec center at that moment, right? It may be like a job. And being willing or building into the process even a way to do that. It's hard, but it seems like that's something that has been meaningful, for places.
That last point resonated with me. I wanted to add that in some of the places where we've worked, Strawberry Mansion comes to mind, we've had to work on a lot of the trust building before, we've not gotten to the project yet. We've had to work with the community on helping to meet some of their needs and desires. So in Strawberry Mansion, for example, we had a project, right? And we came and we were like, hey, we want to do this project. And the community was like, hold on. We have other things that we are interested in. That trail is very nice, and we hope that it happens one day, but we have other needs as a community. So we've been steadily building trust by investing in not only in the organizations there, but in some of the other things that the community is interested in seeing before we get to the park improvement project. So
I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative for one last question before I open it up to the floor. There was and I'll direct it to Malcolm just because it lets him speak freely, but I hope others can talk too. There was an incredible tension that you revealed in the actual governance, to use Liz's terminology, creating rebuild. And you have a city council, which on the one hand for years has decried publicly the lack of diversity in the building trades and project delivery on capital projects, and yet they also, and I don't remember if it was specifically a writing or other people's writing, talk about the attempt by certain folks in council to also ensure that the project gets done via previously existing contracting mechanisms, which have not yet been able to meet those diversity goals. And I'm wondering if you can kind of explain for the layperson what feels to people sitting outside of government is kind of schizophrenic, where you're saying you want one thing, but then you don't. And I was wondering if you have an insight into what actually is going on here, or help us all understand the complexities of governance from a political perspective.
Yeah, definitely still learning and still figuring out the political stuff. But Yeah, a few things. I mean, one, just real quick, that I think kind of undergirds this conversation is you might have heard this term councilmanic prerogative that gets thrown around a little bit, but that's also, I guess, an important piece to rebuild. And the gist of councilmanic prerogative is, I'm trying to say this in a way that's both accurate and treads lightly. But the idea is that any development within, it's kind of an unwritten agreement that any development within a city council district, that city council person, if they represent that district, has to sign off on it essentially ahead of time. Am I totally off on that? I think that's right. And so part of the rebuild, obviously, with these sites being selected in certain city council districts and who gets control over that, that's also a part of that conversation. But specific to talking about the diversity and inclusion initiatives, that's absolutely true. And even, I believe it was last year at some point, I want to say it was back in April, this program called Penn was launched. It was an exciting program, and essentially it provided graduates of CTE programs in Philadelphia public schools with a more direct pathway into the building trades, into the union trades. And it was, hyped as doing a number of different things compared to some similar programs I've tried to, and I guess failed at doing that in the past. And long story short, a number of city council people were, it was a big photo op, and were praising this program, Penn at the time. And then Penn came up in the context of rebuild as being a model for some of what Nicole and her team are trying to do on a little bit of larger scale, with bringing in folks into the building trades, particularly CTE graduates. And when Penn was mentioned then, it seemed like no one in city council recognized it, knew what it was, as well as we're kind of criticizing the idea of using that as I shouldn't say all of city council, but certain members were definitely criticizing the idea of using that as a model to build up and rebuild. So, I guess with all politics, there's always the question of, re-election and these folks wanting to both play to their base and obviously be fighting for their constituents and but also be on camera fighting for their constituents. And so I think, there's been a number of programs over the years that have aimed to diversify the building trades. That's a whole, it's a really, really complicated situation in terms of how you do that. But there's definitely been the sense that, with rebuild, there's an opportunity, of course, to criticize Mayor Kenny and criticize the rebuild team for not doing enough. But there's the question of how much was City Council really, I guess, proactively doing anything about that with past projects, especially capital improvement. So, yeah.
Tension exists.
Tension definitely exists. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Surely there are before I start calling on my students. Yes, sir.
Yeah, frequently in driving around the city, I've encountered school playgrounds where you have this vast expanse of asphalt that has gone through some strange process of plate tectonic shifts with weeds growing out of the cracks, and then in the middle of the thing, occupying 1/100th of the space is a jungle gym. And it just strikes me that you have these already existing spaces, which are tremendously in need, that could be parks that not only, or even beyond parks, rec centers, whatever, that not only serve the needs of the school and improve the school, but could involve the community, more in the fate of the school. And I know that the mayor is a fan of community schools. And so why not direct some of this into creating these existing things, making them into multi-purpose facilities, recreational facilities that would draw in the community and improve the schools at the same time. And, I have to say, as my end kicker on this, if I were a struggling community and I had the choice between a vibrant park and a vibrant school, I'd take the school any day.
Well, I think the response to that a few months ago would be different potentially from the response today, now that the city is retaking control over the school district. So So I think the big question kind of hanging in the air right now is what, if any, are the repercussions for school district facilities in terms of what's the relationship with rebuild, if any? I don't know yet. I will say, again, a few months ago, my answer would have been just that rebuild is necessary because we don't have enough resources to take care of the facilities that we have today. And so, as silly as it may seem, the school district had their facilities and the city has our facilities. But I totally agree. I mean, I think we would all agree, like, what's more important than having a vibrant school with a beautiful place where all the students and their parents want to go to enjoy. And there's some really beautiful projects that have been going on by Trust for Public Land and others, improving school playgrounds. And I think that's going to continue. And then there's this bigger question that we'll see what happens.
Can I say something quickly? I agree that I don't know though if we're being asked to make a choice between schools and parks. So I just wanted to. I think rebuild is an acknowledgement that our public realm creates enormous value for communities and for people, and that to me that includes schools, that includes parks, and that includes all the places where people are coming together to connect and to learn and to share. So I don't know that we're being asked to make a choice. I don't know a lot about Minneapolis. I did get the pleasure of going to a conference there, the City Parks Alliance conference, and I was so struck by what seemed to be a different philosophy, what seemed to be a really great philosophy around investing in the public realm. It seemed that the government there thinks of that the public realm is their highest priority. And so when you visit their parks, they are pristine. You can tell that they're the highest priority or among the highest priority. And you can tell that they think that it brings value for their residents to invest in the public realm. So I don't think we have to choose. I'd love for us to have, to have it.
But there has to be a conscious strategy to marry the two.
Yeah, and maybe that's to come. Maybe, as Nicole said, that's to come. I hope we're not asking people to choose one or the other.
I just had a really quick anecdote because, even just me doing this reporting, and again, like I don't have any formal training in a lot of this. I was talking to a rec leader at a rec facility in West Philadelphia a few weeks ago, and he was just really opening my eyes to also who are the users of these facilities, as well as the people running them and all the jobs that they really have to do, and how it's not, a lot of people just think of rec facilities as athletics, but you're not only dealing with tutoring and mentoring and whatever else the people are bringing in, and obviously some rec facilities have NA meetings or AA meetings, but the story that he shared with me, the gist was that, I'm going to paraphrase, but he said that when a student gets kicked out of school or suspended from school, essentially, and can't go to any other public facility, they end up at the rec center. And it was just really powerful. It really resonated with me. And to also just think that in terms of the interplay between like schools and rec centers and how we still need, vibrant and well-resourced rec centers, because there's obviously a clear connection there. And if a kid, can't be served in one part of the public realm, they end up there. So still a need for that.
Okay, I've got a question for Liz. I'm sorry that I got here a bit late. Okay, so my question for you, Liz, is about your presentation, which I loved, and made me both feel good but also extremely anxious. So good in the sense that I work on cities and common politics and think there's not nearly enough about the kind of ways in which cities can create low carbon leisure opportunities by making urban fabric something that is like democratically accessible and exciting, and the kind of activity that we want to all have, and love spending time with each other and symbols instead of just buying stuff. So that's awesome. But then, so it made me anxious is the housing component, and my sense is, that reading like from the Lincoln Institute people are really getting into land value capture as a mechanism that they're trying to use now to turn the increased property values from investment into something the city can use, because obviously this is now the problem, global housing crisis, anybody in this world talking about much more aggressive interventions in markets? Is anybody in the city departments who are working on the housing issue actually paying attention to this reinvestment stuff? Or is it just like, wouldn't it be nice if, you know, we did something more serious and more robust in terms of intervening in housing markets, but our hands are tied, so like, show a little land value, which I don't think anybody really expects to solve our problems, and just, you know, cope or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question. No one yet is talking about intervening aggressively in markets in the way that I think you're referring to. It is on everyone's radar. It is also a different kind of, it's a problem, as you said, to different degrees in different neighborhoods. And so in some neighborhoods, and this gets their renters and their owners, and owners in neighborhoods, they want their property values to go up. And many of them have been there for decades. They're not like the white upper middle class kind of homeowners that we think of when we think of triggering gentrification. So they're welcoming that kind of change, and their neighborhoods have been neglected. But then there are other places like New York, which is kind of, there are a lot of great things that go on in New York, and it's good to have that as a reference point, but it's also, it can distort what's happening in a lot of other cities because it doesn't really reflect, the level of wealth there and the inequality is just so extreme. But, I think right now, I would say Washington, D.C. with the 11th Street Bridge, following, the Beltline in Atlanta, which they were one of the first to really start asking these questions. How, they were, for those of you, if you're not familiar with the Beltline, it was this ring of kind of, underused paths and parks, and they wanted to both reinvest in that space, but with thinking about transit and thinking about housing, knowing and trying to really build from the beginning. They knew property values would go up. How can we protect, home values here for people? And they had what they thought was aggressive, affordable housing initiatives that both hit some snags along the way because the funds didn't come through in quite the way they anticipated, but also it wasn't nearly enough, which I think, and I suspect, I'm not sure what will happen in DC, but I know there are some people on the ground concerned that it won't be enough, even with this kind of forward-thinking approach, it may not be enough in a city like DC, which is, rapidly gentrifying already. But in other cities, like in the Midwest, it isn't the same problem. But I think it's a conversation, more people are starting to have. I don't, but yeah, in terms of like the big, bold intervention, it's not there yet, at least not that we've seen.
I just wanted to follow up on that, because it strikes me that we had a real aggressive intervention in markets that didn't impact things. So I mean, to talk about
Right. Well,
as
that's
if
true.
everything is very balanced.
Right.
So
Well, that's
maybe
true. Right.
Just to
It's
stop
different.
having those interventions
Yeah.
first.
I think that's true, right? It's who are the interventions for? I think that's the question, right? Yeah.
Quick follow-on, two quick follow-ons, that in the 11th Street Bridge case, that one of the additional interventions, and that's in the narrative that Liz laid out, that 11th Street Bridge is really in a state of becoming, and has very actively trying to learn from the pros and cons of other approaches. And so one of the other things that they've done is to be much more aggressive about a monitoring system before the fact,
Right.
and with third-party monitors, and also doing things like creating a land trust in the area of effect, essentially. So I think that would be one of the things potentially we could test here.
I so want to bring that model here. I
Well,
do.
So happens we have a land bank.
Well, and we have
we've
a
got a bunch of pieces that are not connected.
Yeah.
Now, which
Yeah,
gets to the governance.
Yeah.
Right.
The effect of governance ultimately to connect things that aren't connected. The other thing I just want to quickly say is that one of the sort of silent but I think profound victories of the rebuild effort is that it's not creating something new and shiny. It's not mortgaging the future to try to sort of and with a trickle down theory to benefit everybody, which is we all know is kind of the often repeated lie of our elected officials. Sorry, maybe. to keep investing in stuff we've already got. And I think it's not capital P source preservation, but it is like really profound, very sustainable, ultra sustainable policy of figuring out how to reinvest and keep reinvesting. And with all these equity concerns already on the table, I think that it bodes better than more casinos or sports stadiums.
Before Mike, sir?
This is, I guess, a suggestion in the form of a question, and it relates a little bit to some of the things you said. As to councilman's privilege, which is very common in America, across the country, in the United States Senate has similar institutions. Why do they get involved, and why do they choose certain builders and certain investors? Well, it's simple, follow the money. And as a journalist, you may be able to follow that. Philadelphia politicians have a very difficult time raising campaign funds. So it doesn't take a whole lot to sway their interest in the form of money or possibly jobs for some people they know. And it's something worth researching, I think. You're going to have all these projects, and you don't want them to get all skewed or distorted. And by the one of the problems that minority and women contractors have is they don't have a lot of money to give to these elected officials, and so they're always going to be on the outside looking in.
Yeah. I was just going to add on to that real quick. One of the things I don't think I did mention about NTI was, or I think I just alluded to it, was there was all this leftover money for years and years, and even I think up until 2015, which was almost at the end of the Nutter years, or was the end of the Nutter years, end of Nutter's second term. So this was like 4 terms essentially after it had been introduced. There were still tens of millions of dollars that were unspent. And there was all these, I don't know how much this is, again, I wasn't here, so I don't know how much this is confirmed, but there was always, rumors about, I guess, individual city council members wanting to save the monies, also to deploy it, in terms of, which is a common, I guess, like pork barrel thing in government, but, to deploy it before re-election or to save the money so that they could, use it politically. Again, I don't know how much validity there is to that, but it just kind of speaks to, again, following the money.
And part of my point is these people can't really look into that or talk about it.
That's all to me.
And maybe some other researchers do that too.
Mike?
It's always seemed to me that we live in a sort of ping pong environment where if we look at Rendell, let's build up Center City. If we look at streets, let's go to neighborhoods. If we look at Nutters, let's go to Center City.
Yep.
And come now, it's like let's look at the neighborhoods, and we have this sort of fashion of equity du jour that may have some origins in the Obama administration. Now we're in a federal government that is looking to severely disinvest in everything, including the social safety net, which seems like it's going to have an extraordinary impact on a city that has a 27% poverty rate. What's your plan for sort of
Nicole, how are you going to save us? Jamie, how are you going to save us?
I turn it over to you.
I quit. I missed the question.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one thing, this is not, answering your question, but just the one thing that has struck us as we've been doing the research is, and I know maybe we take it even for granted now at this moment that we're talking about housing and small business protection and workforce development in the context of public space. But that's in itself rather, I don't know if maybe radical is too strong a word, but at a time, this was about parks. You didn't really talk about any other things. There was no need to. We could invest in a park. It was a kind of discrete, small thing to do. And that was one of the reasons there was money for it, because it didn't necessarily tap into the other things that community development was under the purview of community development, right? And now, partly because of what we've seen with certain projects like the High Line, but also because of certain structural trends, we are realizing that we have to talk about all of this together, and I think that that's important. And it just so happens, for a lot of reasons that we can talk about and break down here, that there is money being spent on public spaces right now in cities. That's something that's happening across the board. And so it's a good thing that more cities are going, and directors of projects are going to their parks department and are going to other places and saying, no, we can't just talk about the park. We actually have to talk about property values, because no one else at that table wants to talk about property values or housing, right? They just want to talk about their entity, their little silo that they work on. And I think for the first time, there is an understanding that there needs to be attention at these other avenues. And it's going to take time to break down some of the boundaries that have happened and that have been built up over the years. But, it's happening, and it's happening in many cities at the same time.
So, so we're a relatively small, there are about 30 of us now, and young nonprofit. So we're in no way prepared to answer all of those questions now. But it's funny that you should bring those questions up. We are going through strategic planning, and so we're thinking about some of those things. And I think, us being a nonprofit, it helps and hurts us in different ways. So it can be hard sometimes, in that our mission is the park, but we don't own the park, right? We're a support to the city in advancing the park system. I think it can be helpful sometimes because we're not the city. We work closely with the city, but we're not the city. Mm-hmm. And so just today, we were talking about, okay, how do we react when the political, sands shift? So right now, we're in a wonderful position in that our former executive director is now the Parks and Rec commissioner, right? So she was at the Conservancy for, I believe, 4 years. She helped grow us from just a fundraising organization to one that has programs and projects. And she believes in what we do, right? And so I think, and additionally, the managing director used to have her job. And so we're in a good position now in that we have a lot of leaders who believe in parks and have worked in that realm for a long time. But we might not be, in a few years. And so we talked, just today about, if the sands were to shift, okay, we go from partner to advocate, maybe. Maybe that changes the way that we're working with the city, where we're still a partner to the city, but we're pushing them in certain areas. And I think we have the ability to do that as a nonprofit. We've also been thinking about endowments, even though we're far away from creating one. We've been thinking about how we create an endowment for the organization, but also for projects that we're, in areas of the park that we're pretty vested in. So maybe we'll be able to answer your question in a few years.
Context that I designed a lot of parks in the 80s and very early 90s when it's all been done.
Cool. Well, you had it hard.
In New York. I have a different mindset about what, these shifting sands around.
And my board members, they remember that time, and they talked about how hard it was then and how good of a position we are now, having some of the leaders that we have, but that it might not always be like this.
Nyasha, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I had a question. I wanted to go back to a question earlier about investing more into schools. We saw like a lot of this investment that happened within like the past 10 years and 13 years. Philadelphia especially, a lot of public schools have been closing. And you mentioned that there is sort of like this disconnect between public school and public work projects like parks and things like that. But do you see like investment in more community schools, which actually partners with organizations
Sure, we're doing that in a limited sense and would love to be able to do it more. So as an example, one of our partners for Rebuild is actually Youth Build. So they're a high school where kids can go to learn all different kinds of skills and trades, but one piece of what they learn is development, project development. So within Rebuild, as we get projects, we'd love to be able to, our aim is to carve out pieces of those projects for the students to actually work on and deliver as a part of our capital project team. And we also want to work with the students on community engagement, particularly in neighborhoods where we need to go out and kind of do door knocking and engage people right where they are. We're also in the project in Parkside that we're building. It has a lot of green stormwater infrastructure elements through our partnership with the water department. So we hope to work with the School of the Future and to help the kids, have the kids actually help us to monitor what's going on out there with respect to the GSI. So we've done it in small instances. I hope we can do that even more and work with kids even more as we're developing parks and programming at parks. But certainly we're doing it for kids in large part. I also wanted to mention earlier that when I've heard the mayor talk about all the things that he hoped would happen through the soda tax, you know, he invested in schools through the pre-K program. He invested in community schools, and he invested in Rebuild. Those were the major components of where the soda tax went, or is going, rather. And when I heard him talk about that investment, he talked about it as sort of a kind of not quite cradle to, or as a younger and older youth strategy. He was doing the pre-K for the young kids. He was doing the community schools for kids at all levels, and he was doing public spaces to help all the other kids that strategy wouldn't reach. And so I think that the Rebuild is more connected to schools than it might initially appear.
I'll just briefly add, proximity to schools is something that we specifically look at in the sort of structure that we've developed in terms of prioritizing sites, how we look at sites. So proximity to schools and PAL centers, city health centers, all of those are important. They all sort of offer opportunities to sort of get more going. And we do work really closely with the Office of Community Schools at the City of Philadelphia, and we try to coordinate in terms of how we look at neighborhoods and the data that we're using. But I think the really big question on the table is again the future of in Philadelphia with a city-controlled school board. How do city initiatives get coordinated with the school district?
Way over there, and then gentleman over there.
It's a question, it's a connected question. I guess it'd be partly data-driven and partly the community engagement piece is, my experience with some libraries, rec centers in the city of Philadelphia, parks, whatever, but especially where there's a recreation center or library, is that they really function as a community center, and it's across the ages. There's nonprofits and nonprofits. There's the intermediaries who, want to run things and whatever. But there's the not-for-profit association. There are a huge number of participatory groups. They may not be a 501c3, but they have to book time in these centers. Or they're also like classes or dance movement. There's all kinds of groups, not just meeting like the Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever, but there's just a huge amount going on in these centers that's recreation, athletic based, and even those teams have associations, parents. I guess you're working with the friends groups, and what you said about the data-driven, just about who's representing the community and what the representative sample, it seems both as part of your data gathering about who's here and part of possibly your strategy for engaging. It's just even the door-to-door, but they could be surveying their own groups, you know, in terms of civic community stuff going on, and which would be if they didn't have a hole in the roof, you know, I mean, sometimes there's film series, there's all kinds of things going on, book clubs, you know, there's a million things.
You're absolutely right. And I will say, I am such a fan of all of the volunteer groups who do stewardship. I will admit that a lot of them are pretty, they can be sort of entrenched. They've been around for a long time. A lot of the leadership, it consists of folks who have lived in the neighborhood for a long time and held leadership positions. So sometimes that can result as them maybe not being as open as they might be, especially as their neighborhoods are changing around them, right? So a part of the work that we're doing, a part of the capacity building work that we're doing is to help the groups look at their neighborhoods as they exist now and think about leadership succession and how to engage new residents and how to be more open. Simple things like posting your meetings, right? And having them at a regular time. So that's a piece of the work that we're doing. If it's okay, I don't know if it's okay to break the rules. If it is okay, I wanted to ask George to talk. George is doing a lot of that work at rec centers with the groups there, and it's fascinating and important. So.
There are no rules. We're not a government.
George, a microphone.
Sure. And then.
Since George is an urban studies grad.
That's right.
Yeah, so my name is George Matisick with the Philadelphia Parks Alliance. So we're kind of we work with Jamie. The Conservancy kind of does the parks side of the house. We've kind of been doing the recreation side of the house over the last couple of years. Really beginning with the rebuild process, and as an advocacy organization, historically, we started to see at a lot of the rec centers throughout the city just how great the needs were beyond just the built environment, but really how the needs were much deeper as we're kind of talking about here. And really for us, it is about how do we begin to sort of recast these spaces, these rec centers, not just as athletic facilities, but as true community centers. And so a lot of that begins with how do we engage the community, right? So a lot of the work that we're doing is literally as just like Jamie's doing with the Fairmount Park Conservancy. We're going door to door in the communities. We're inviting people out to their recreation center. We knock on every door in sort of what we define as the catchment area there. And then we start the conversation. We have a pizza dinner. We invite everybody out, and we start the conversation not by saying, what does the rec center need, but by saying, what does the community need? And when you change the dialogue a little bit in that way, you start to get much different answers than we need new basketball hoops or we need new soccer fields, right? You start getting things like we need more after-school education programs. We need more job training programs. We need all of these other types of programs that the communities are really looking for. We are blessed in the city to have more than 150 of these community centers. And in addition to the libraries, you're looking at more than 200 spaces that have no barriers to entry to be able to have programs available. So when that student goes home from school at 3 p.m., they then they're going to the rec center passively, right? They're not being told to go to the rec center. They choose to go to the rec center. And so we want to have those types of programs. So that's really where we're trying to engage the community, including the kids, and sort of designing what the future of those programs might be. And hopefully those programs can sort of dictate what the built environment looks like, whereas historically the built environment dictates what the programs look like. Hope that answers. Is that okay?
We have time for one last question. Nicole, I'd like, can you expand on this maintenance endowment? Is this a new idea? Is it going to be enough? Or I thought on the angle about all these new facilities having an impact on the city's operating budget going forward, or else you wind up 15, 20 years with leaky roofs again.
It's not going to be enough. I said that we hope to have a maintenance endowment. I know that that's something that William Penn, the foundation, is also interested in. Randy, it was it was very gracious of you to make that comment about, this is not about shiny things. This is about taking care of what we have, and we're I'm an old capital budget analyst, so I get really profoundly that the city isn't among us, we're not taking care of our stuff. And we're not gonna for a long time. So we have to figure out lots of different ways to bolster the investments that we're making in the facilities. So whatever we are able to do in terms of a maintenance endowment, it will be a little down payment. We'll hope to rally support for that among foundations and in our fundraising efforts. We'll hope to get some traction in neighborhoods and working with friends groups and advisory councils around that idea, and with project users. So if you're, if this is a neighborhood that you have an attachment to, like, let's put some money down on that. I can tell you that there is a little bit of precedent for the idea. And the Free Library has some really modest, I think they have probably an endowment that is probably not so modest, but they have some modest endowments that they're using to bolster their capital investments for information technology specifically, and then a little bit for, once in a while there's a library that just has a really awful, disgusting kitchen, and they'll be able to replace the counters and the refrigerator. So not enough, but we're just hoping to sort of move the ball in the right direction.
Excellent. I hope you can all join me in thanking our panelists for the